I need you to hear me out.
We should have left before the rain started.
Whoa, Paul, it's cold.
Watch the reaction closely.
A little more heat than we played.
I need a moment.
I think we need to look at the results again.
I know you'd show up.
Let's get this ready.
We should get this done before dawn.
Almost there, just a few more blocks.
You need to tell me the truth.
You're grinning like a fool again.
A little more heat than we played.
We should have left before the rain started.
Watch the reaction closely.
I need a moment.
Let me see that hand. I think we need to look at the results again.
There you go.
I told you it was worth the trip.
think we need to talk about this.
Before Anthony Bourdain became the man whose voice seemed capable of carrying an entire world inside a single sentence, before the books, the television cameras, the airports, the crowded markets, the late-night meals and the global reputation for finding meaning in places other people overlooked, there was simply Tony, 19 years old, restless, arrogant, uncertain, and standing at the edge of a life he did not yet understand. That is where Tony begins its interest. Matt Johnson's 2026 film does not attempt to compress the entire legend of Anthony Bourdain into a conventional cradle-to-grave biography. Instead, it narrows its attention to a formative summer, placing a young Bourdain in Provincetown and following the moment when the chaotic, exhausting, seductive world of the professional kitchen begins to change the direction of his life. The premise itself is deceptively simple. A young man who imagines another future for himself stumbles into restaurant work and discovers that the heat, pressure, danger and strange fellowship of the kitchen awaken something inside him. But the film is less interested in presenting that discovery as a neat success story than in examining the confused person who has to become lost before he can begin finding a direction. The real Anthony Bourdain would eventually become famous as a chef, author and television storyteller, but Tony deliberately approaches him before any of that identity has solidified. Dominic Sessa plays him as a teenager who has not yet become the confident public figure audiences remember. This Tony is still searching for a version of himself worth believing in. He wants to be a writer, and that ambition matters because it reveals something essential about the young man even before food becomes central to his future.
You're grinning like a fool again.
He already wants a life larger than the one immediately in front of him. He wants experience.
We should get this done before dawn.
He wants stories. He wants to feel that his existence is moving towards some meaningful destination. Yet wanting a meaningful life and knowing how to build one are completely different things. And the tension between those two realities becomes one of the most important forces driving the film. The story places Tony in Provincetown, where his path leads him into the chaotic environment of a restaurant kitchen. The setting is crucial because the kitchen does not function merely as a workplace. It becomes the film's pressure chamber. Outside it, Tony can remain abstract. He can dream about becoming a writer, imagine a more glamorous future, complain about disappointment, and indulge the uncertainty of being young. Inside the kitchen, imagination is suddenly confronted by physical reality. Food has to be prepared. Orders have to be completed. Mistakes have consequences. Heat is real. Time moves quickly. Nobody is especially interested in a newcomer's romantic idea of himself. The work either gets done or it does not. That collision between Tony's inner image of himself and the demands of the world around him gives the film much of its dramatic energy. A conventional biopic might have treated the first restaurant job as the obvious origin point of a future celebrity. Here is the exact moment when the young Bourdain discovers his calling. Tony appears more interested in the messiness of that process. Discovery does not arrive as a heavenly revelation. It comes through exposure. Tony enters a world full of people who already understand its rules, people who possess skills he does not have, people who are rougher, stranger, and in some cases more comfortable with chaos than he is. He has to observe them, compete with them, irritate them, and gradually learn from them. That is one reason the film's coming-of-age structure works so naturally with its biographical subject. Even without knowing what Anthony Bourdain eventually becomes, the story contains an immediately recognizable emotional question. What happens when a young person discovers that the life they imagine for themselves may not be the life they actually need? Tony's original ambitions are not meaningless simply because the kitchen enters the picture. In fact, the connection between his desire to write and his attraction to the restaurant world becomes more interesting when viewed together. Writing requires observation. It requires curiosity about people, language, and hidden worlds. The kitchen gives him something to observe. It gives him a new language, new personalities,
I think we need to
new
look at the results
rituals,
again.
and new forms of conflict. Long before he becomes the Bourdain audiences know, the film suggests the beginning of the appetite that would later define so much of his work, an attraction to environments that are messy, intense, human, and alive. Sessa's challenge is considerable because he is not simply playing a fictional teenager. He is playing a younger version
Told
of
you it was
someone
worth the
whose
trip.
voice and personality became internationally recognizable. The obvious temptation would be imitation. A lesser performance might constantly remind the audience that this is supposed to be Anthony Bourdain, filling scenes with familiar mannerisms and hints of the adult figure to come. The more interesting approach is to search for the instability beneath the icon, and that is where the performance finds its strongest dramatic material. Tony can be cocky without being secure.
You need to
He
tell
can
me the
appear
truth.
rebellious without actually knowing what he is rebelling toward. He can project confidence while remaining painfully inexperienced. Those contradictions make him feel like a person rather than a collection of future characteristics. The film's Tony is therefore most compelling when his self-image comes under pressure. Youthful arrogance can be funny, but the story does not allow arrogance to become his entire personality. He is still vulnerable to rejection. He is still capable of embarrassment. He is still young enough to make decisions based on emotion, and then discover
Almost
that the
there, just a few
consequences
more
are more
blocks.
complicated than he expected.
Told you it
The
was
professional
worth the trip.
kitchen becomes important precisely because it exposes those weaknesses. Tony cannot simply announce himself into becoming somebody. He has to learn. He has to work. He has to survive the humiliation of not knowing what he is doing. That process also gives the restaurant scenes an almost sports film quality. Although the film's arena is made of burners, knives, smoke, noise, and rapidly disappearing seconds rather than a boxing ring or football field. Every newcomer enters with a fantasy about talent. The reality is repetition, technique, endurance, discipline. The body has to learn before the ego can fully understand. This is where the story's genre contribution becomes particularly interesting.
you to hear me
Tony is a biography, but its central movement resembles a coming-of-age
grinning
film
like a fool
and a
again.
mentorship drama. The future celebrity is temporarily stripped of his future status.
We should get this
What
done before
remains
dawn.
is a young outsider entering an established world and trying to earn a place within it. The figure who most clearly embodies that world is the chef and restaurant owner played by Antonio Banderas. His presence gives the film a different kind of energy from Tony's restless uncertainty. Tony is searching. The older man already belongs. He understands the rhythms of the kitchen and the human ecosystem surrounding it. That difference naturally creates the conditions for mentorship, although the relationship is more interesting when understood as something earned rather than sentimental. A mentor in a story like this cannot simply appear to explain life to the protagonist. The real dramatic value comes from
You
contrast.
need to tell me the
Tony
truth.
has ideas about who he is. The people around him have no obligation to accept those ideas. Banderas brings considerable weight to that contrast. His role matters because Tony needs someone who represents competence without making competence
You're
look
grinning like a
sterile.
fool again.
The kitchen is not portrayed as an elegant institution where refined wisdom is gently handed down to the next
little more
generation.
heat than we
It is a
plates.
workplace shaped by personalities,
should leave
pressure,
before the
and
rain
friction.
started.
Tony is entering a culture, and culture is not learned from one inspirational speech. It is learned through exposure to behavior. Who commands respect? Who loses control? Who can work under pressure?
I need a moment.
Who knows when to joke and when not to? Who understands the difference between performance and actual ability? For Tony, these questions slowly become personal. At first, the kitchen is simply another place in which he finds himself. But the longer he
We need to look
remains
at the results
inside its
again.
orbit, the harder it becomes to separate the work from the transformation taking place within him. The most important change is not that he suddenly becomes a finished chef. It is that his attention begins to shift. He becomes engaged by a world he did not fully expect to matter to him. That distinction is essential. Great turning points in character stories often look small from the outside. A person accepts a job. They meet someone. They return to a place they had originally intended to leave behind. The action itself may be ordinary, but its repetition changes the person performing it. That is the kind of transformation Tony is built around. The film understands that an origin story becomes less interesting when every scene loudly announces its historical importance.
You need to tell me the truth.
Tony does not know that the audience is watching the beginning of a legend. He does not walk into the kitchen with a soundtrack telling him that his destiny has arrived. He is simply living through a summer. He is making choices, sometimes badly. He is responding to people. He is experiencing attraction, embarrassment, frustration, and excitement. The fact that viewers know something about the future gives ordinary moments an additional layer, but the story still needs to allow those moments to exist on their own terms. This is also where the film's relationship with biography becomes more
Almost there, just a
complicated.
few more blocks.
The project is inspired by Bourdain's
Told you it
early
was worth
life
the
and by
trip.
material associated with his own recollections, but the film does not present itself as a literal documentary reconstruction of every event. Recent discussion around the film has emphasized that Matt Johnson approached the story as a dramatized interpretation of a formative period, blending documented elements with fictionalized storytelling rather than claiming scene-by-scene historical certainty. That distinction matters because the emotional truth the film is pursuing is not identical to a courtroom standard of factual reconstruction. The central question becomes whether the young man on screen feels capable of growing into the figure history remembers. That approach can be risky. Anthony Bourdain was not an obscure historical figure whose personality exists only in a few distant documents. He spoke and wrote extensively about
I need you
himself,
to hear me out.
while also becoming famous enough that millions of people formed their own
You're
understanding of
grinning
him.
like a fool again.
Any dramatization, therefore, carries expectations. Some viewers will want
We should get this
exact
done before
accuracy. Others will accept invention if it illuminates character. The film's decision to focus on a single formative period is its answer to that problem. Rather than pretending it can contain an entire complicated life in under 2 hours, Tony concentrates on the period before certainty existed. That uncertainty extends into Tony's romantic life as well. Emilia Jones plays
get this
Nancy,
ready.
and her presence brings another dimension to the story because coming of age is never only about finding a career. A young person can discover a professional direction while simultaneously remaining emotionally confused. The film's
need to look at the
romantic
results
material has to operate within that broader uncertainty. Tony is not yet a man who understands himself, which means he cannot automatically understand what other people need from him either. Attraction can feel like connection. Rebellion can feel like freedom. Desire can feel like purpose. One of the recurring lessons of youth is discovering that these things are not interchangeable. The value of Nancy as a character, therefore, depends on how her interactions with Tony reveal
your
his
time, no
limitations.
rush.
Relationships in stories are often strongest when they expose something the protagonist cannot see alone.
Focus
Tony
on the
may think of
details.
himself as adventurous, but does adventure become an excuse for avoiding responsibility? He may think of himself as honest, but is he actually capable of understanding the effect he has on other people? He may want intimacy while still behaving as though his own confusion should be everyone else's problem. These are the questions that give the emotional side of the film consequences beyond the immediate romance. At this stage of the story, however, Tony remains more defined by possibility than by certainty. That is why the Provincetown setting feels so appropriate. He is away
Little
from
more
the settled
heat
structure
than we
of a
played.
conventional future
Whoa,
and
it's
immersed in a
cold.
temporary world. Summer itself has a built-in sense of suspension. Ordinary rules can seem less permanent. New people appear. Nights stretch longer. A decision that would feel impossible at home can feel inevitable somewhere else. But temporary worlds can permanently alter the people who enter them. The restaurant intensifies that feeling. It is both a job and a hidden society. For someone
need to
like
look at the
Tony,
results again.
who is still trying to decide where he belongs, that society offers something powerful. Membership, not unconditional acceptance, because kitchens are not sentimental spaces in the film's imagination, but the possibility of becoming useful. There is a profound difference between being admired for who you claim to be and being valued because you can actually contribute. Tony has spent part of his life imagining what he might become. The kitchen asks a simpler and harsher question. What can you do now?
Take your time, no
That
rush.
question begins changing the rhythm of the film. The story becomes increasingly less concerned with the abstract future
Focus on
and
the
more
details.
concerned with immediate experience. Can Tony keep up? Can he learn? Can he survive the personalities around him? Can he distinguish between rebellion that looks exciting and the kind of discipline that actually creates freedom? These questions are not answered all at once. The film lets Tony move through them as a young person would, unevenly. Leo Woodall's Sal becomes another important presence within this environment, where Banderas' character represents experience and authority. Sal belongs more directly to the chaotic social current surrounding Tony. Characters like this
little more
matter
heat
because the
than we played.
protagonist's transformation
Whoa,
cannot
cold, it's
come from
cold.
one respectable mentor alone. Young people are often shaped just as much by the friends and troublemakers who make destructive behavior look exciting as by the teachers who tell them to be careful. The restaurant world is therefore not presented as morally simple. It offers Tony purpose, but it also exposes him to excess, bravado, and forms of behavior that can be thrilling precisely because they seem to exist outside ordinary limits. This is where the film begins to deepen its portrait of ambition. Tony wants more from life, but more is not automatically a noble desire. More experience can become recklessness. More freedom can become self-destruction. More confidence can become cruelty. The young Bourdain's journey matters because he is not a blank page onto which wisdom can easily be written. He brings his own flaws into every
more
new
heat
environment.
than we played.
The kitchen does
Whoa,
not
cold,
magically
it's cold.
purify him. It gives those flaws somewhere to collide with other people. And that collision is beginning to reveal something important. Tony may have entered this world believing he was looking for a temporary escape from disappointment, but the work is gradually becoming harder to dismiss as temporary. The sounds, personalities, and pressures of the kitchen are beginning to occupy space inside him. What once looked like an accidental detour is starting to resemble a direction. Yet a direction is not the same thing as a destination. The more Tony becomes involved in this new world, the more the summer demands from him. Friendships become complicated. Attraction carries consequences. The difference between fitting in and losing himself
You're
becomes
grinning like a
harder
fool
to
again.
recognize. The kitchen can teach discipline, but it can also reward the performance of toughness.
A little more
Tony
heat
is young
than we
enough
played.
to be seduced by both. And before this summer can shape the person he will eventually become, it first has to test whether the version of himself he has been pretending to understand can survive at all. That test becomes more difficult because the world Tony has entered refuses to remain only a place of work. The kitchen follows him beyond the kitchen. Its language, its attitudes, its temptations, and its strange sense of belonging begin to bleed into everything else. For a young man who has spent so much time uncertain about where he fits, that belonging is powerful. There is something seductive about discovering a group of people
I think we need
who
to
do
look at
not
the results
ask him
again.
to explain every strange impulse before allowing him into their world. The rules are often brutal, but they are visible. Work hard enough and people notice. Fail and everyone notices even faster. Survive the pressure and a kind of respect becomes possible. Tony begins responding to that system because, beneath his rebelliousness, he has been looking for exactly this kind of challenge. His desire to become a writer had always involved the possibility of becoming somebody through imagination, but the kitchen introduces him to a more immediate form of identity. Here, he cannot live entirely inside his own head. He has to perform. He has to pay attention. He has to understand that confidence without competence quickly becomes embarrassing. The first major development in his transformation is therefore not mastery but humility, even if Tony is far too proud to recognize that word as the lesson he is learning. That humility does not arrive peacefully. One of the pleasures of a coming-of-age story built around someone like Tony is watching him resist the very experiences that are changing him. He still wants to appear as though he is naturally above carrying too much. He can treat seriousness as a weakness and effort as something that should be hidden behind attitude. But professional kitchens have a way of exposing false performances. There is nowhere to hide when the work speeds up. A person can bluff through a conversation. They cannot bluff through every order. Eventually, the pressure separates image from ability. The film uses this pressure to build Tony's character gradually. He does not suddenly wake up transformed into a disciplined young chef. Instead, he begins noticing details. The rhythm of preparation, the hierarchy between people, the significance of timing, the strange intimacy created when several people are forced to operate together under stress. Cooking becomes more than an activity because Tony begins understanding that food is connected to people. Every plate is the result of cooperation, conflict, skill, exhaustion, and personality. The kitchen may look chaotic from outside, but inside that chaos is a structure that has to be learned. This is one of the most important bridges between the young Tony and the person Anthony Bourdain would eventually become. The later Bourdain became famous not simply for talking about food, but for using food as a way into other worlds. A meal could lead to a story about history, politics, family, migration, class, or memory. Tony does not need to announce that future constantly. Instead, the early stages of that curiosity can be felt in the way Tony becomes increasingly attentive to the people around him. He is learning that the kitchen contains stories because people contain stories. That realization also complicates his original ambition to become a writer. Perhaps the problem was never that he wanted the wrong thing. Perhaps he simply had not yet found the world he needed to write about. The film becomes more interesting whenever it allows those two identities to exist in tension. Tony does not have to choose between being a person fascinated by language and a person fascinated by cooking as though they are opposite futures. What he is slowly discovering is that experience gives language weight. A writer who wants to understand people cannot remain permanently protected from people. The kitchen is not a literary classroom, and that may be exactly why it becomes valuable to him. It teaches him about work through work. It teaches him about failure through failure. It teaches him about human behavior by placing him close to people when they are tired, angry, competitive, intoxicated, generous, or frightened. At the center of this education is the difficult question of masculinity. The restaurant environment Tony enters is shaped by performance. People prove themselves. They challenge one another. Weakness can be mocked. Fear can be disguised as humor. Affection may be expressed through insult or through the willingness to stand beside someone during a crisis, rather than through openly emotional language. Tony is naturally attracted to this world because it gives him another way to hide uncertainty. If everyone is performing toughness, he can perform it too. But performance has consequences. A person can begin acting reckless in order to convince others that they are fearless, only to discover that the act itself has created real danger. This is where Tony's youth becomes impossible to separate from the choices he makes. He is not simply exploring a career. He is experimenting with identity, and experimentation can become destructive when there is no stable understanding underneath it. The film's atmosphere reflects that instability. The energy of Provincetown, the restaurant, the social world around Tony, and the intensity of young adulthood all combine to create the sense of a life moving too quickly for its protagonist to fully interpret while he is living it. Tony is having experiences before he knows what they mean. Only the audience, because it knows something about the future, can recognize that certain moments may eventually become part of a larger personal mythology. Yet the film is strongest when it resists turning those moments into obvious historical landmarks. A conversation does not need to end with Tony announcing what he will someday become. A night does not need to be framed as the night everything changed. Real lives rarely announce their turning points in such convenient language. Often, the meaning arrives later. Something that seemed temporary becomes permanent in memory. Someone met by accident becomes important. A job accepted for practical reasons becomes a vocation. A mistake becomes a lesson only after enough time has passed to understand what it cost. Tony is still far too close to his own experiences to understand them that way. This gives part 2 of the story a sense of forward movement without giving it false certainty. He is changing, but he does not yet know how much. He is becoming attached to the kitchen, but he may still believe he can walk away whenever he wants.
There you go.
He is finding people who influence him, but influence can be mistaken for freedom when a young person feels liberated simply because they have entered a new environment. That distinction becomes especially important in his relationship with Sal. Sal represents part of the attraction of Tony's new life because he seems more comfortable inside its chaos. To Tony, people like Sal can appear to possess the confidence he lacks. They know how to behave. They understand the social codes. They can turn recklessness into a performance of identity. For someone still constructing himself, imitation becomes tempting. But imitation is one of the film's quiet dangers. Tony can learn from the people around him without becoming them. The difficulty is recognizing the difference. When someone is 19, experience itself can feel like proof of wisdom. The person who has done more dangerous things may appear more mature simply because they have crossed boundaries others have not. But Tony gradually reveals the limitations of that thinking. Exposure is not the same as understanding. A person can experience everything and still learn nothing. The pressure of relationships makes this clearer. Tony's connection with Nancy carries the weight of a different kind of expectation from the kitchen. In the restaurant, mistakes can be corrected by working harder, moving faster, or learning the proper technique. Emotional relationships do not operate with such obvious rules. Tony may be able to observe another person's behavior, but observation is not automatically empathy. He may want affection without understanding the responsibility that comes with being important to someone. This gives the romantic dimension of the film a valuable function. Nancy is not merely present to provide Tony with another source of drama. Her relationship with him challenges the version of freedom he is beginning to celebrate. Tony wants the right to explore, experiment, and move through the world without being trapped by other people's expectations. But every meaningful relationship creates expectations because another human being is involved. The desire to avoid being controlled can easily become an excuse for refusing accountability. Tony is therefore forced into a conflict that many coming-of-age stories explore, but few make entirely comfortable. How do you become yourself without treating everyone around you as a supporting character in your personal transformation? A young protagonist is naturally the center of his own story. The people around him are not. They have their own needs,
Let's get this ready.
fears, and limits. One sign of maturity is learning to recognize that difference. The problem is that Tony has not reached that stage yet. His mistakes continue to emerge from the same mixture of insecurity and confidence. He can be charming because he is alive to the possibilities of the world. He can also be selfish because he assumes his own hunger for experience is more important than the damage left behind. The film does not need to transform him into an idealized young genius in order to make his journey meaningful. In fact, his flaws make the story more convincing. The adult Bourdain's later honesty about his own contradictions and destructive tendencies gives additional resonance to a portrayal of youth that does not attempt to make him admirable every second. This is another area where the film's limited focus becomes a strength. A full biography might rush through decades of addiction, success, marriage, travel, writing, fame, and personal struggle in an attempt to explain the entire man. Tony instead stays with the beginning of a pattern. Appetite. Not only appetite for food, but for life. Tony wants to feel something intensely. He wants the world to open. He wants to enter rooms that were previously closed to him. The kitchen promises access. The nightlife promises access. Relationships promise access. Risk itself can begin to feel like access. But every appetite has the potential to become too large. That possibility starts hanging over the story, even when the immediate scenes remain energetic or funny. Tony's discovery of the restaurant world is genuinely exciting because the audience can understand why he is attracted to it. The film does not present danger as attractive merely because danger is fashionable. It understands the emotional logic. A person who feels uncertain about his place in life can become attached to environments where intensity makes uncertainty disappear for a while. When the kitchen is at full speed, there is no time to wonder who you are. You simply have to do the next thing. That temporary relief can be intoxicating. The restaurant, therefore, offers Tony two forms of escape. It gives him a possible future, but it also gives him a way to avoid thinking about the future. He can lose himself in work. He can lose himself in other people. He can lose himself in the mythology of being young and reckless. These possibilities are not identical, and the film gradually begins separating them. Work can build identity. Escapism can dissolve it. The tragedy for someone like Tony is that both can feel equally alive in the moment. Antonio Banderas' character becomes increasingly important as a counterweight to this confusion. He represents experience not because he has all the answers to Tony's life, but because he understands that the kitchen's romance cannot be separated from its discipline. There is glamour in the chaos only because somebody is capable of controlling enough of it to keep the place functioning. The fire, noise, and speed are not freedom in themselves. They are part of a system. Tony slowly begins learning that distinction. The people he admires are not necessarily the loudest. Skill has its own authority.
There you go.
A person who knows exactly what to do under pressure does not need to constantly announce it. This may be one of the most valuable lessons Tony receives because so much of his own behavior has been based on projection. He wants people to see him as interesting, rebellious, and destined for something more. The kitchen introduces him to people who are too busy doing their jobs to be impressed by the performance. That changes him. Not immediately, not completely, but enough. The film's narrative construction benefits from allowing change to arrive through accumulation. Tony becomes more invested because he keeps returning. He learns because he keeps watching. He earns more responsibility because the world around him begins responding to what he can actually do rather than what he says about himself. The process is almost invisible until the audience realizes that the young man who entered the restaurant expecting only a temporary experience is no longer looking at it from the outside. He has begun to care, and caring is dangerous for someone whose identity has been built partly around the ability to leave. The emotional stakes rise at precisely this point because commitment introduces the possibility of
Told you it
loss.
was worth the trip.
As long as Tony treats everything as temporary, failure cannot fully define him. If one job goes badly, he can walk away. If one relationship becomes complicated, he can claim he never wanted to be tied down. If one environment rejects him, he can tell himself he was never truly interested. But once he begins caring about the kitchen, those defenses weaken. Now failure matters because something is at stake. The screenplay's strongest structural move is to connect this growing commitment with Tony's increasing exposure to consequences. His world is becoming larger, but the choices within it are becoming less reversible. He is no longer merely observing other people's lives. He is participating in them. That means he can hurt people. He can disappoint them. He can make promises without understanding whether he is capable of keeping them. The same is true of his own ambitions. Tony has spent time imagining himself as a writer, but imagination eventually demands evidence. What has he lived? What has he seen? What does he know about
You're
himself?
grinning like a fool again.
The restaurant is beginning to answer those questions, although not in the polished form he might have expected.
A little more
His
heat,
education
then we
is
plate.
dirty, exhausting, and occasionally humiliating.
Before the rain started.
That is exactly why it feels more useful than the fantasy he carried into the summer. Behind the energy of these developments is the broader irony that makes the film's subject so compelling. The audience knows that Tony Bourdain's future will eventually involve both the kitchen and storytelling. At 19, he does not know that. The story is therefore built around a gap between the person and the legend. We watch the person making choices without access to the legend's ending. That gap prevents the film from becoming a simple exercise in destiny. Tony is not guided by an invisible guarantee of success. He can make terrible decisions. He can misunderstand people. He can waste opportunities. The future Bourdain exists only outside the frame, in the audience's knowledge.
There you go.
Inside the story, Tony still has to earn whatever future is waiting for
Told
him.
you it was worth
As the
trip.
summer continues, that uncertainty becomes sharper rather than disappearing. The more he learns about the kitchen, the more he realizes how much there is to learn. The more he becomes connected to people, the more complicated those connections become.
I think we need
The
to
more
talk
freedom
about
he
this.
finds, the more he has to confront the consequences of using it badly. And somewhere beneath the noise, the heat and the exhilaration, a quieter change is beginning to take place. Tony is starting to understand that a life does not become meaningful because you choose the most exciting road. Meaning has to survive after the excitement fades. It has to remain when the night is over, when the work becomes
think we need to
repetitive,
talk about this.
when the people you love demand something more difficult than charm, and when the future finally asks whether all your talk about wanting a bigger life was ever matched by the willingness to grow up. For the first time, that question is beginning to frighten him, because now he has found something he may actually lose. That fear changes the texture of Tony's summer because until now, movement itself has been his defense. Whenever life becomes
Almost there, just a few more
uncomfortable,
blocks.
there is always another place to go,
Told you it was
another
worth the
person to
trip.
meet, another night waiting to become a story. Restlessness has protected him from having to sit too long with himself. But the restaurant has created a problem he did not expect. It has given him something stable enough to care about. The more he becomes involved in this world, the harder it is to pretend that nothing matters. For someone who has spent much of his young life defining freedom as the ability to escape, that realization is almost threatening. Commitment can look suspiciously like confinement when you are 19. Tony can understand the appeal of working in a kitchen without immediately understanding what it means to dedicate himself to the craft. He can enjoy the company of other people without being prepared for the obligations that come with friendship. He can fall in love with possibility
hear me
while
out.
remaining terrified of choosing one possibility over another.
You're
Every
grinning like
choice
a fool
closes a
again.
door, and Tony has reached the stage where the endless number of open doors that once seemed exciting
We should
is
get this
beginning to
done
feel
before
like
dawn.
another form of paralysis. The kitchen, strangely enough, gives him his clearest experience of commitment because it does not permit endless hesitation. There are moments when decisions have to be made. A service cannot pause while someone contemplates their identity. The next order arrives whether Tony feels ready or not. A mistake has to be fixed. A task has
Let's
to
get
be
this ready.
completed. The discipline he once may have associated with boredom begins revealing a different meaning. Discipline is not necessarily the enemy of freedom. Sometimes it is the only thing that allows a person
need
to
to look at the
become
results
capable
again.
of anything. This is a significant step in Tony's journey because his early attraction to the restaurant world was tied partly to its apparent lawlessness. The kitchen looked exciting because it seemed to exist outside conventional expectations. The people around him were intense, unconventional, and often willing to ignore the polished behavior expected elsewhere. But beneath that surface is a demanding code. You cannot truly belong to the world simply by enjoying its rebellion. Eventually,
Take your
you
time,
have
no
to
rush.
carry your share of the weight. Tony begins discovering this distinction through experience rather than instruction.
Focus
He
on the
watches what
details.
happens when people fail each other. He sees how quickly camaraderie can turn into conflict when pressure rises. He begins to understand that being accepted by a group does not mean every member of that group will protect him from the consequences of his actions. The kitchen may feel like a family at times, but families are complicated. They create loyalty, resentment, competition, and dependence at the same time. That complexity becomes increasingly important because Tony himself is changing the way
Need a
he
moment.
relates to other people. At the beginning, he could enter a room and treat the people
little more
inside
heat
it as
than
part
we
of an
played.
adventure.
Whoa,
Now those
Paul, it's
people have
cold.
become individuals whose opinions matter to him. Their approval can affect him. Their disappointment can wound him. Their criticism can no longer be dismissed as easily because he has started respecting some of them. Respect is difficult for Tony because it requires him to admit that other people know things he does not. This may sound like a simple lesson, but for
You
a
need to
young
tell me the
protagonist driven by ambition, it is a profound one. Tony's confidence has often been built on potential. He believes he is capable of becoming more than his current circumstances. There is nothing wrong with that belief. In fact, without it, he might
You're
never
grinning
have
like a
left
fool
the
again.
safety of his earlier assumptions. The problem is that potential can become an excuse. A person
more
can
heat
spend
than
years
we played.
insisting they are destined for something extraordinary
should
without
have
doing the
before the rain
ordinary
started.
work required to reach it. The kitchen offers no respect for potential without effort. You may be talented, but can you perform when exhausted? You may be intelligent, but can you listen? You may have dreams, but can you
need a
arrive
moment.
tomorrow and begin again? Tony's growing awareness of these questions gives the film a deeper emotional movement. The story is no longer only about a teenager discovering a possible profession. It is becoming a story about the difference between wanting an identity and accepting
we
the
need to look at
labor
the results
required to
again.
build one. That labor is not presented as romantic every moment. One of the film's strengths is that it can recognize the excitement of the restaurant world without pretending that excitement makes the work easy. The kitchen is hot, repetitive, and exhausting.
There you
People
go.
can be difficult. The hierarchy can be unforgiving.
I
The
told you it
glamour
was
that
worth the
exists
trip.
in Tony's imagination is repeatedly challenged by physical reality. Yet that reality is exactly what keeps pulling him back. This is where the film's relationship to food becomes more meaningful. Food is not treated simply as an aesthetic object. something beautiful to photograph before moving to the next scene. The preparation matters. The labor matters. The people behind the food matter. Tony's attraction to the kitchen begins with experience, but it grows because he starts recognizing the hidden world behind what others consume casually. A customer sees a meal. Tony begins to see everything required to create it. That shift is small, but it anticipates the larger perspective that would eventually define Bourdain's public work. The adult figure became associated with crossing borders and eating in places that mainstream audiences often ignored. But what made his storytelling distinctive was not merely that he traveled. Travel alone does not create insight. The more important impulse was curiosity about the people whose work, traditions, and histories surrounded the food. In Tony, the beginning of that curiosity is much less polished. He is not yet a global storyteller asking strangers about their lives.
There you go.
He is a teenager trying to understand the people standing a few feet away from him. That makes the story more intimate. Before he can learn to look outward at the world, he first has to learn how to look at the people immediately around him. The difficulty is that curiosity and empathy are not identical. Tony may find other people fascinating while still failing to treat them well. He may enjoy hearing their stories while assuming his own story is the most important one in the room. He may recognize someone's pain without understanding what responsibility comes with that recognition. These contradictions keep him from becoming an idealized hero. The film benefits from this moral ambiguity because a coming-of-age narrative becomes predictable if every painful lesson leads directly to improvement. Real people can recognize their flaws and repeat them. They can apologize and then make another mistake. They can understand what they should do while lacking the emotional discipline to actually do it. Tony's journey is meaningful precisely because growth is presented as unstable. The relationship with Nancy becomes one of the places where this instability is hardest to hide. By now, the energy of attraction cannot remain separated from the practical realities of being close to another person. Tony's world is expanding, but expansion has consequences. He wants room to experiment with his life, and that desire may be sincere, but sincerity does not prevent someone else from being hurt. What makes this tension effective is that Tony does not need to be portrayed as deliberately cruel for his behavior to cause pain. Immaturity often works through blindness. A young person can become so focused on discovering themselves that they fail to notice how much they are asking others to tolerate. They assume their confusion is temporary and therefore harmless. But the people around them experience the consequences in the present.
Take your time,
Nancy's
no rush.
importance lies in forcing Tony toward that realization. The question is no longer simply whether he feels
Focus on the
something.
details.
Feeling something is easy. The more difficult question is what he does with it. Can he communicate honestly? Can he recognize another person's needs even when they interfere with his own freedom? Can he accept that intimacy requires more than showing up when the mood feels right? These questions begin connecting Tony's private life with the larger pattern developing around him. In the kitchen, he is learning that relationships depend on reliability. In romance, he is learning the same lesson from another direction. Someone has to be there when needed. Someone has to mean what they say. Someone has to understand that actions become part of another person's emotional reality. Reliability is not naturally Tony's strongest quality. That makes the contrast between his talent and his character increasingly important. A person can discover what they are good at before discovering how to live responsibly. The film refuses to suggest that finding a calling automatically solves every other problem. Tony may be becoming more focused professionally while remaining deeply confused personally. Success in one area can even make self-examination easier to avoid. If he is improving in the kitchen, perhaps he can convince himself that everything else will eventually work itself
I need
out.
you to hear me out.
But life rarely organizes itself so conveniently. The
You're grinning like a
screenplay
fool
begins
again.
tightening these separate pressures together. Work influences Tony's
We
relationships.
should get this done before
His
dawn.
relationships influence his state of mind. His hunger for excitement affects the choices he makes in both worlds. What initially seemed like separate adventures gradually become parts of the same character problem. Tony wants intensity. The kitchen gives him intensity. Love gives him intensity. Conflict gives him intensity.
Let's get this ready.
Risk gives him intensity. But intensity is not peace, and it is not necessarily purpose. This becomes one of the film's most compelling thematic ideas. Tony is attracted to experiences that make him feel fully alive, perhaps because ordinary life has begun to seem frighteningly empty by comparison. There is something understandable in that desire. Nobody wants to believe their youth will disappear into routines they never chose. Tony wants stories because he wants his life to feel like one. The danger is that people who constantly chase intensity can begin manufacturing drama whenever life becomes quiet. The restaurant world around him makes that danger difficult to separate from its
Take your
appeal.
time, no rush.
Chaos is part of the culture Tony has entered. Strong personalities collide. People push
Focus on the
limits.
details.
The energy can be exhilarating precisely because it feels unpredictable. For Tony, unpredictability becomes evidence that he is living a more authentic life. But unpredictability can also destroy the stability needed for anything lasting. This is where the older, more experienced figures around him provide an important contrast. They understand the excitement because they have lived inside it, but experience has also taught them that surviving chaos requires boundaries. Tony has not yet reached that
I need a moment.
understanding. To him, boundaries can still look like compromise.
A little more
That
heat
creates
than
friction
we
between
plate.
his self-image
Whoa,
and the
Paul,
lessons
it's
he is
cold.
being offered. A mentor can guide someone only if that person is willing to hear something they do not want to hear. Tony is willing to learn about food because learning makes him better at something he increasingly loves. He is less willing to learn about himself because self-knowledge threatens the identity he has carefully performed. The film's direction, in this sense, is strongest when it allows silence and reaction to carry meaning. Tony does not always need to announce what he has learned. Sometimes the important change is visible in the gap between what he would have said earlier and what he says
You need
now.
to tell me the
A
truth.
young man who once treated every criticism as an attack may begin listening before responding. A person who once laughed away embarrassment may find that the laughter no longer works. These are the subtle shifts that make a character arc believable. They also make Tony's mistakes
You're
more
grinning like a
painful
fool again.
because the audience can see that he is capable of becoming better. If he was simply careless or selfish from beginning to
Little more
end,
heat
there
than
would
we
be little
plate.
emotional complexity in watching him fail. Instead, the story shows someone caught between old habits and new awareness. He is beginning to understand himself just enough to recognize the distance between who he is and who he wants to be. That distance becomes harder to ignore as the summer moves
I need a
forward.
moment.
The temporary quality of Provincetown is also beginning to change. At first, the season itself seemed endless. There was always another day, another shift, another night. But time in a coming-of-age story often becomes visible only when it
I
starts
think we
running
need to look
out.
at the results again.
Tony cannot remain 19 forever. The summer cannot remain suspended. The people around him have lives that extend beyond his personal transformation. This awareness introduces a new kind of urgency. Earlier, Tony chased experiences because he feared missing out on life. Now he begins facing another
Told you it
fear.
was worth the
What if
trip.
he has found something meaningful too late to understand it properly before everything changes? That question makes his growing attachment to the kitchen more emotional. He may have entered expecting a temporary job, but temporary experiences can reveal permanent desires. The problem is that recognizing a desire does not automatically tell a person what to do next. Tony has to consider whether this world is truly his future, or merely the most exciting thing that has happened to him recently. The difference matters. Passion can be a revelation, but it can also be a phase. The only way to know is to continue after the novelty disappears. Tony has not yet reached that point, but the film is moving him toward it. The early thrill of entering the restaurant world is beginning to coexist with responsibility. He cannot simply enjoy the mythology of the kitchen anymore. He is starting to become part of its daily reality. That transition may be less glamorous, but it is more important. For the first time, Tony has the opportunity to
Almost
discover
there, just a
whether
few
he
more
loves the
blocks.
idea of this life or the
Told you
actual
it was
work
worth
of
the
living it.
trip.
The answer emerges gradually through his behavior. He returns. He watches.
There you go.
He learns. He becomes more invested in details that would once have seemed insignificant. The transformation is not completed by one dramatic declaration, because the story understands that identity is built through repetition. You become someone by doing something often enough that it begins changing the way you think. That is happening to Tony. But another transformation is taking place at the same time, and it is far less comfortable. As he becomes more capable, the consequences of his failures become harder to blame on ignorance. Early mistakes can be explained by youth. He did not know better. He had no
I
experience.
need you to hear me out.
But knowledge creates responsibility. Once Tony
You're grinning
begins
like a fool
understanding
again.
what his actions do to others, continuing to make the same choices becomes something different.
We should
The
get this done
story
before
is
dawn.
therefore approaching a crucial emotional threshold. Tony can no longer remain only the inexperienced boy discovering the world. The world has started teaching him. What he does with those lessons will determine whether the experience changes him or merely becomes another story he tells about himself. This is where the atmosphere surrounding the film grows more complicated. The same
Let's get this
freedom
ready.
that first attracted Tony now contains pressure. The same people who made him feel accepted can confront him with disappointment.
I need show
The same kitchen that gave him a sense of purpose can expose his weaknesses more clearly
I
than
think we need to
anywhere
look at the
else.
results again.
There is no longer an easy escape into the fantasy that everything will somehow work out because he is young. Youth is not a permanent excuse, and somewhere in the middle of the noise, Tony begins to sense that. He may still resist it. He may still make choices that reveal how far he has left to go. But resistance itself has changed. Earlier, he fought against expectations because he wanted to prove he could define himself. Now
your
the
time,
harder
no rush.
battle is internal. He is beginning to realize that defining himself means accepting responsibility
Focus
for the
on the
person he is
details.
becoming. The kitchen has given him more than a possible profession. It has given him a mirror, and Tony does not always like what he sees in it. That recognition brings the story to its next and more dangerous stage. Discovering a talent can change a person's direction. Discovering a flaw can demand something much harder. Talent asks, "What can you become?" A flaw asks, "What must you change?" For Tony, both questions are now impossible to
I need a
avoid.
moment.
And as the summer moves toward the choices that will test his relationships, his ambition and his growing sense of identity, the world he once entered looking for adventure begins asking for something he never expected to give so soon. A decision. Not about what kind of story sounds exciting, not about what version of himself looks impressive, but about what kind of man he is willing to become when nobody else can make that choice for him. A decision sounds simple when it exists only as an idea. In reality, the hardest decisions rarely arrive with a single dramatic question waiting to be answered. They reveal themselves through a series of smaller choices, each one appearing manageable on its own, until the person making them finally
You
looks
need to tell
back
me the
and
truth.
realizes that a direction has already been chosen. Tony is reaching that point now. The summer that once felt open and limitless has quietly begun narrowing around him. The restaurant is no longer an accidental destination. The people around him are no longer
You're grinning like a
strangers.
fool again.
His work is no longer something he can dismiss as temporary whenever commitment becomes
A
frightening.
little more heat.
Even his
than we
mistakes
plates.
have acquired a different weight because he understands
Should've left
more than he
before the rain
did
started.
when he first arrived. The person who entered this world searching for experience is beginning to discover that experience changes the person seeking it. That change is not clean. Tony does not suddenly become wise because the story has reached its later
I need a
stages.
moment.
If anything, greater awareness makes his confusion more difficult. Ignorance can be comfortable because it leaves room for excuses. Once Tony begins recognizing patterns in himself, those excuses lose their power. He knows that his restlessness
to look at
is
the
not
results again.
always freedom. He knows that charm cannot repair every wound. He knows that the thrill of being accepted into a new world does not release him from responsibility within it. The real question is whether knowing these things will make him behave differently. That is where the emotional pressure of the film becomes strongest. Tony's
I told you
story
it was
is
worth the
not
trip.
built around a villain standing in his path. The obstacles are more personal. He is fighting against his own immaturity, his appetite for escape, his fear of being ordinary, and his resistance to the idea that becoming somebody requires accepting
We need
limits.
to talk about
Those are difficult enemies because they often speak in his own voice. Every reckless impulse can be explained as independence. Every refusal to commit can be described as keeping possibilities
tell me the
open.
truth.
Every failure can be blamed on a world that supposedly does not understand him. But the more Tony grows, the harder it becomes to believe his own excuses. The kitchen plays an important role in forcing that confrontation because it has no interest in the mythology Tony creates around himself. The work remains. The pressure remains. Other people remain. A shift cannot be completed through self-dramatization. The next task still has to be done. This is why the professional world Tony discovers becomes so important to his development. For perhaps the first time,
Almost there, just a few
he is
more blocks.
involved in something that exists
you it was
independently of
worth
his
the trip.
moods. The kitchen does not become easier because he is feeling emotionally confused. His colleagues do not automatically adjust their expectations because he has spent the night questioning his future. The world asks something from him, and that demand can feel almost cruel to a person accustomed to treating his own feelings as the center of every situation. Yet there is also liberation in it. Tony begins understanding that purpose can sometimes emerge from responsibility rather than preceding it. He may have imagined that one day he would discover his great passion and then naturally become dedicated. The restaurant teaches him something more complicated. Sometimes dedication comes first. You return. You practice. You
I need you to
improve.
hear me out.
You become reliable. Then, slowly, the
You're
thing you
grinning
once
like a fool
considered
again.
merely a job begins to matter because you have invested part of yourself in it. That process gives the
get this done
film a
before dawn.
convincing emotional foundation. Tony is not transformed by destiny descending from above. He changes through participation. Every shift leaves something behind. Every interaction teaches him something, even when he refuses to admit it. Every mistake removes another layer from the confident image he has tried to maintain. The relationship between Tony
this
and the
ready.
experienced figures around him also evolves because mentorship cannot remain one-sided. At first, Tony is the
I
observer.
need to show up.
He watches people who understand the world better than he does. Later,
I think we
he
need to
has
look at
to
the results
demonstrate what he has learned. That transition is essential. Knowledge given but never tested has little dramatic value. Eventually, the student must act without being told exactly what to do. This is where Tony begins showing the first signs of genuine growth. He is still impulsive, still flawed, and still capable of choosing excitement over wisdom, but there are moments when his reactions begin changing. He listens. He notices.
Take your time, no rush.
He understands that another person's anger may contain a truth about his own behavior. These moments are not large enough to
Focus on the
erase
details.
everything that came before, and they should not be. The film's emotional credibility depends on allowing growth to remain incomplete. At 19, nobody is finished. The Tony on screen is particularly far from finished because the future audience associates with Anthony Bourdain is still unimaginable from his own perspective. That future gives the story a peculiar emotional tension. We know that the young man will eventually find ways to connect cooking and storytelling, but knowing the destination does not erase the importance of the journey.
Need a moment.
In some ways, it makes the uncertainty more poignant. The audience
Little more
can
heat
see
than
possibilities
replace.
Tony cannot.
Whoa, cold,
But
it's
Tony
cold.
wisely keeps returning to the person rather than the legend. This matters especially as the story moves toward its emotional climax. A weaker version of the film might begin forcing obvious references to the adult Bourdain, treating every significant moment as an origin for a famous trait. A particular meal would explain his future love of travel. A difficult conversation would explain his future cynicism. A kitchen lesson would explain his later confidence. Life does not work with such perfect symmetry, and the film is more interesting when it allows Tony to remain complicated. He is not becoming Anthony Bourdain because one summer provides every answer. He is simply beginning to become himself. The distinction sounds subtle, but it changes the entire meaning of the story. Becoming an icon is something the world
grinning like a
decides
fool again.
later. Becoming a person is what happens in private, through choices that may never appear important at the time.
more heat
Tony's
than we
relationships now become central to that private transformation. The people who have entered his life during the summer represent different possibilities. Some reflect the version of himself that wants to keep moving, keep experimenting, and refuse to be contained. Others represent discipline, responsibility, and the uncomfortable truth that genuine respect must be earned. Nancy, meanwhile, remains connected to the emotional question Tony has struggled with throughout the story. Can he want closeness without understanding the responsibility that closeness requires? By this point, the answer cannot remain
I
abstract.
think we need to look at the results
Tony's
again.
behavior has consequences, and emotional consequences do not disappear simply because the person responsible eventually learns a lesson. This is one of the more mature aspects of the story's coming-of-age structure. Growth does not guarantee forgiveness. Realizing that you have hurt someone is important, but it does not allow you to control how they respond.
Told you it was
Tony
worth the
has to
trip.
begin learning that other people are not obligated to remain available simply because he has finally become capable of understanding their pain. That realization is difficult because it attacks another form of youthful arrogance. Tony has often moved through the world believing, at least unconsciously, that his story is still being written, and that therefore every broken relationship can potentially be repaired in the next chapter. But life does not always offer that structure. Sometimes the chapter closes because someone else decides they have had enough. The film gains emotional force when Tony is confronted with that possibility. For all his appetite for stories, he is beginning to learn that he cannot control every ending. This connects directly to his changing relationship with the kitchen. There too, he cannot control everything. A service can go wrong. A mistake can create consequences. Another person may outperform him. The difference is that the kitchen has taught him what to do after failure. Return, learn, continue.
Almost there.
His
just a few more
personal life
blocks.
is harder because no
Told
recipe
you it was worth the
exists.
trip.
That contrast deepens the character. Tony may discover that he feels more competent dealing with physical pressure than emotional uncertainty. In the kitchen, problems are immediate. Something is overcooked, underprepared, or missing. The solution may be difficult, but the problem can usually be named. Human relationships are not so generous. Someone can be hurt in ways Tony did not intend. Silence can mean several things. Anger can hide disappointment. Love can remain even after trust has been damaged. The more the film explores this emotional uncertainty, the more clearly Tony's central weakness emerges. He is extraordinarily interested in experience, but experience does not automatically teach him how to stay. He knows how to arrive.
You're grinning like
He
a
knows
fool
how
again.
to enter a room. He knows how to make an impression. Learning how to remain
should get this
present
done
when
before
things
dawn.
become difficult is something else entirely. That is the lesson beginning to shape the final stretch of his summer. The genre conventions of the coming-of-age film become especially effective here because the protagonist's greatest transformation is not necessarily external. Tony does not need to win a competition or receive a grand reward to demonstrate that he has changed. The more important shift is internal.
Let's get this
He
ready.
begins recognizing that adulthood is not simply the freedom to do whatever you want. It is the ability to understand what your choices do to the people around you and to accept the consequences without running away. The film does not turn this
we need to look at the
realization
results
into a sermon. Its power comes from the way it is woven through the story. Tony still enjoys the world around him. The kitchen does not become less exciting because he has learned responsibility. If anything, he begins appreciating it more deeply because he now understands the work beneath the excitement. He sees that the people he respects are not merely fearless adventurers. They have survived enough to understand what matters. This gives Antonio
Take your
Banderas'
time, no
role
rush.
added importance in the film's final movement. The older generation does not represent a boring alternative to
Focus on
Tony's
the
freedom.
details.
It represents perspective. Experience has not eliminated complexity. It has simply removed certain illusions. Tony is beginning to realize that maturity is not surrendering his hunger for life. It is learning which hungers deserve to be fed and which ones will eventually consume him. That idea may be the closest the film comes to defining the emotional meaning of its title character. Tony is hungry. He is hungry for a larger life, for adventure, for recognition, for intimacy,
I need a moment.
for identity, and for the feeling that his existence will become more than an ordinary sequence of
A little
days.
more heat.
The
than we
restaurant
played.
gives him a literal
Whoa,
and symbolic
it's
language
cold.
for that hunger. But hunger without limits can become destructive. Food satisfies because it has form. A meal begins and ends.
Watch the reaction
It is
closely.
prepared with choices, ingredients, and discipline. Appetite becomes meaningful through the act of creating something rather than merely consuming
before the
everything
rain started.
available. Tony's emotional life has not yet learned that discipline. This is why the film's climax needs to feel less like a simple triumph than a confrontation. By now, he has discovered something valuable about himself, but
You need to
discovery
tell me
has
the truth.
placed him under greater pressure. He cannot return completely to the person he was. Once a person finds a world where they feel alive, pretending not to care becomes harder. Once Tony understands that he has real ability, he has to decide what responsibility comes
You're
with that
grinning like a
ability.
fool again.
And once he begins recognizing the damage caused by his choices, he has to decide whether self-awareness will remain another
heat
story he
than
tells
we
about
played.
himself, or become a reason to change. The
Should I
answer
before the rain
develops
started?
through action. There is an important difference between Tony earlier in the film and Tony now. Earlier, every difficult situation could become another excuse to prove his independence. Now, he is beginning to understand that walking away
I need
is
a moment.
itself a choice with consequences. Refusing to decide does not keep every possibility alive forever. Eventually, the world decides for you. That realization creates the strongest sense of urgency in the story. The summer is ending, whether Tony
we need to look
feels
at the
ready
results
or
again.
not. The temporary world he entered is approaching the point where its temporary nature can no longer be ignored. The rhythms that seemed permanent because they repeated every day are beginning to reveal their fragility. People move on. Seasons change. Jobs evolve. Relationships either survive the pressure placed upon them or they do not. Tony cannot preserve the moment simply because he has finally learned to appreciate it. This gives the later scenes a bittersweet quality. The more he understands what the summer has given him, the closer he comes to losing the exact circumstances that made those discoveries possible. That is often how coming of age works. A person learns the value of a period of life at the same moment they begin leaving it behind. But leaving is not necessarily losing.
You need to tell
Tony
me.
has spent much of the story treating departure as escape. Now he begins encountering another possibility. A person can leave a place and carry what they learned into the next stage of life. The restaurant does not have to remain frozen in time for its influence to survive. Provincetown does not have to become a permanent home for the summer to become permanent in memory. What matters is what Tony takes with him. And by now, the answer is more than cooking. He has learned that skill requires discipline. He has learned that belonging must be earned. He has learned that
Almost there, just a few
intensity
more
can
blocks.
disguise emptiness.
I told you it was worth
He
the
has
trip.
learned that other people do not exist only to assist his personal story. Most importantly, he has started learning that the person he wants to become cannot be created through imagination alone. He has to do the work. That phrase carries different meanings now. It means the work of cooking, practicing, and learning. It means the work of showing up. It means the work of listening when listening is uncomfortable. It means the work of admitting fault without immediately demanding forgiveness. Tony has not mastered any of this. The story would become dishonest if it suggested otherwise. But the point of a formative summer is not that it completes a person. The point is that it makes it impossible to remain exactly the
I
same.
need you to hear
By
me
the
out.
end of this stage, Tony stands in a different relationship to his
You're
future.
grinning like a fool.
Earlier, the future was a fantasy filled with undefined greatness. Now it is beginning
get
to
this
look
done
like a
before
road
dawn.
built from choices. That is less glamorous, but far more real. He may not know where the road leads. He does not know about the books, the kitchens, the cities, the journeys, or the global audiences waiting somewhere beyond the horizon. He only knows that something has changed. The young man who wanted a story now has one beginning to form around him, and for perhaps the first
Let's
time,
get this ready.
he understands that the best stories are not created by avoiding consequences. They are created by living through them. As the summer reaches its final emotional reckoning, Tony must face what this new understanding
I
costs
think we
him.
need to look at the results
Growth
again.
is often described as gain, but every transformation contains loss. To become more responsible, he has to surrender certain illusions about freedom. To become more honest, he has to see himself without the protection of his own mythology. To commit to a direction, he has to accept that other possibilities will remain unexplored. That is the price of choosing. And Tony, who has spent so much of his life wanting every door to remain open, is finally standing
Take your
before
time,
one
no
that
rush.
cannot be entered halfway. What happens next will not complete the man Anthony Bourdain will someday become.
Focus
No
on the
single
details.
summer could do that. But it will complete something equally important. The moment when Tony stops waiting for life to reveal who he is and begins accepting that he will have to participate in the answer. The heat of the kitchen, the people he has met, the relationships he has tested, and the mistakes he cannot undo have all brought him here. Now the noise begins to fade, and in the space left behind, Tony has to decide what remains when the adventure is over.
I need a moment.
A little more heat than we played.
Whoa, Paul, it's cold.
Watch the reaction closely.
We should have left before the rain started.